The rain drummed against the cracked window of Sarah's apartment, a steady rhythm that matched the weight pressing down on her chest. The room smelled faintly of mildew, the damp seeping through the thin walls of the shabby two-bedroom unit. She sat at the kitchen table, its surface marred by scratches and coffee stains, staring blankly at a notice in her hands. Termination of employment. The words swam before her eyes, their stark black ink a cruel confirmation of what she had feared for weeks. Her boss at the diner had been apologetic but firm. Business was slow, and cuts had to be made. Sarah was at the top of the list. Her 2 children, Ellie and Max, played quietly in the corner, their laughter a faint reprieve from the chaos in her mind. Ellie was braiding the frayed hair of a second-hand doll while Max made car noises, his toy zooming over the worn carpet. They didn't understand what this meant, not yet. But soon they would feel it. Sarah rubbed her temples, exhaustion radiating through her body. Since her divorce 2 years ago, life had been a series of battles. The legal fees had drained her savings, and the child support payments from her ex-husband were inconsistent at best. Moving into this apartment had been her only option after losing their home. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it, the contents of the fridge already stretched thin. A stack of unpaid bills sat at the edge of the table, a physical manifestation of her mounting despair. "Mommy?" Ellie's voice broke through her thoughts. "Can I have some juice?" Sarah forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart." She crossed the room, opening the fridge to reveal its meager offerings, a half-empty carton of milk, a few apples, and a jug of orange juice. She poured a small glass, careful not to take too much, and handed it to Ellie. Returning to the table, Sarah stared out the window, her reflection superimposed over the city's dull glow. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm blared, followed by muffled shouting. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, or for her children. As the noise faded, a memory surfaced, the day her divorce was finalized. She had sat in a courtroom, her head bowed as the judge's gavel came down. The lawyer's cold words echoed in her ears even now. "You'll have to rebuild from here." She clenched her fists. Rebuilding seemed impossible when the foundation was gone. But then, a flicker of resolve ignited in her chest. She had 2 little faces depending on her. That night, as her children slept, Sarah pulled out an old notebook and a pen. The flickering light of the table lamp illuminated the page as she began to write. Steps to a better life. Find a new job. Research financial aid programs. Go back to school. Her pen paused, hovering over the paper. She had always dreamed of becoming a lawyer, even before her marriage. But that dream had been buried under years of compromise and sacrifice. Now it seemed absurd. How could she afford law school? How could she balance that with raising 2 children? Yet the thought lingered, stubborn and unyielding. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a distant fantasy. It felt like a lifeline. Sarah set the pen down and leaned back, the weight of her situation still pressing heavily on her. But now, amid the storm of uncertainty, a single thread of hope remained. And for her children, she would cling to it. The diner hummed with life, clinking silverware, sizzling grills, and the murmur of conversations blending into a chaotic symphony. Sarah balanced a tray of plates on one arm, expertly dodging a rushing busbill. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, but she forced a smile as she approached the table. "Here's your order. Let me know if you need anything else," she said warmly. The couple at the table barely acknowledged her as she placed the plates down. It was just another day, another endless shift. Yet Sarah's mind wasn't entirely in the moment. A conversation she had overheard earlier lingered in her thoughts. At the counter, 2 regulars had been talking about a government tuition assistance program for single mothers. Sarah had paused, eavesdropping as she refilled their coffee cups. They mentioned reduced tuition, flexible scheduling, and the chance to start over. "Hey, you okay?" came a voice behind her. It was Maria, her coworker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Sarah nodded quickly. "Yeah, just tired." Maria raised an eyebrow. "You've been staring off into space all morning. What's on your mind?" Sarah hesitated, then spilled the details of what she'd overheard. She finished with a shrug, brushing off the idea before Maria could. I mean, it's not like I could actually do it. Law school? With my schedule and the kids? It's impossible. Maria folded her arms. Impossible? Sarah, you've been running on fumes for years and still manage to keep your kids fed, clothed, and loved. If anyone can do the impossible, it's you. Her words struck a chord, but doubt still gnawed at Sarah. I wouldn't even know where to start. Maria leaned closer, her tone firm. Start by believing you can. Look into the program. What's the worst that can happen? You don't qualify? You're already here, working your butt off. You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. That night, after putting Ellie and Max to bed, Sarah opened her laptop. The screen's glow lit her tired face as she typed. Tuition assistance for single mothers. Search results filled the screen, and Sarah's heart raced as she read. The program covered a significant portion of tuition, with resources for childcare and night classes. As she scrolled through the application process, a memory surfaced. Her younger self, sitting in a high school classroom, dreaming of becoming a lawyer. The dream had felt so alive then, before life got in the way. Maybe it wasn't too late. Her finger hovered over the Apply Now button. Taking a deep breath, she clicked it. The alarm blared at 5:30 a.m., cutting through the silence of the tiny apartment. Sarah groaned, her body protesting as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. She had gone to sleep just 3 hours ago after cramming for an upcoming exam. The morning passed in a blur. She packed Ellie and Max's lunches, braided Ellie's hair, and reminded Max to put on his shoes for the third time. By 7 a.m., she had dropped them off at school and was rushing to the diner for her shift. The hours dragged as she took orders, cleared tables, and smiled through the exhaustion. At one point, she burned her hand on a hot plate but barely flinched. Pain had become part of her routine. By 3 p.m., her shift ended, and she was rushing back to pick up the kids. The walk home was a cacophony of voices, Ellie excitedly recounting her day while Max interrupted to talk about a bug he found. Sarah nodded and smiled, though her thoughts were already on her law textbooks waiting at home. After dinner and homework time with the kids, Sarah tucked them into bed. Ellie hugged her tightly. Good night, Mommy. You're the best mommy ever. The words filled Sarah with both pride and guilt. She wished she could give them more time, more attention, more stability. When the apartment was finally quiet, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her law books spread out before her. Her eyes burned, and her head ached, but she forced herself to focus. Tonight's topic, tort law. Her phone buzzed with a text from a classmate in her study group. Did you finish the practice questions yet? She sighed. Not yet. She glanced at the clock. Midnight. Just one more hour, she whispered to herself. But the hour turned into 2. Then 3. When she finally crawled into bed, it was nearly 4 a.m., and her alarm was set to ring again in 90 minutes. As she drifted off, her last thought was of Ellie's drawing from earlier, a stick-figure version of Sarah in a suit, holding a briefcase. Above it, Ellie had written in wobbly letters, "My mommy is a lawyer." The image stayed with her, a tiny spark of motivation in the overwhelming darkness. The classroom buzzed with nervous energy as students shuffled into their seats. Sarah sat at the back, clutching her notes, for the mock trial that was about to begin. She had barely slept the night before, after another long shift at the diner, but today was different. This was the first opportunity to prove to herself that she could do this. The professor, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, called the class to attention. Today, you'll each present your arguments in front of your peers. We'll be simulating a case involving domestic abuse. You've all received the case files. You're defending the victim. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had chosen to represent the victim, a woman who had been in an abusive relationship and was seeking legal protection. It wasn't just a class assignment, it was personal. This was the kind of case she had always dreamed of handling. When it was her turn, Sarah stood and made her way to the front of the room, her palms sweaty. Her classmates watched, some with curiosity, others with doubt. She had often felt like an outsider in law school, too old, too tired, too different from the younger students who seemed to have everything figured out. But today, she wasn't going to let those insecurities win. She began with a steady voice, laying out the facts of the case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we stand here today to defend a woman who was not only physically harmed but emotionally destroyed by the very person she trusted most. Our client Jane Doe has lived in fear for far too long. Her words flowed more easily than she expected, and the nerves slowly started to fade. She spoke from the heart, drawing on the experiences she had seen in her own life and in the lives of women she had met over the years. She used her limited but hard-earned legal knowledge to create a compelling argument. By the time she finished, the classroom was silent. The professor nodded approvingly. Well done, Sarah. A clear, powerful defense. You've demonstrated both legal aptitude and empathy, key qualities for any good attorney. A sense of pride swelled in Sarah's chest as she sat back down. It wasn't a win yet, but the acknowledgement was a victory in itself. She had taken a significant step forward, and for the first time, she truly believed she could do this. It was one of those nights when everything seemed to collapse at once. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills, unpaid rent, overdue utilities, and a looming credit card payment. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through the papers, adding up the totals in her head. The children were asleep, but their faces, their futures, haunted her. How could she keep going? How could she continue to work full-time, study law, and raise 2 kids, when it felt like there was never enough time, never enough money? Her phone buzzed with a text from Ellie's school. Reminder, school fees due next week. Please pay by Friday. Sarah's heart sank. She had no idea how she was going to pay for that. Her rent was overdue, and her part-time waitress job didn't pay nearly enough to cover everything. She buried her face in her hands, feeling the weight of it all. It wasn't just the money, it was the exhaustion, the constant stress, and the fear that she was failing her children. She reached for her laptop and opened her school's portal, hoping for some kind of miracle. But the latest grades were in, and she had barely scraped by in her last exam. The pressure was mounting, and Sarah was starting to crack under it. In a moment of weakness, she opened a new tab and searched for loan options. But the numbers that appeared on the screen only added to her sense of hopelessness. The interest rates were astronomical, and she couldn't afford to pay them back. That was when the phone rang. It was Maria. Sarah, you still there? Maria's voice was warm but concerned. I'm fine, Sarah replied, forcing the words out even as tears threatened to spill. Maria wasn't buying it. You don't sound fine. I'm coming over. 10 minutes later, Maria knocked on the door. Sarah opened it, trying to pull herself together, but Maria saw through the facade instantly. What's going on? She asked softly. I just don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. The bills, the kids, the school. I'm not sure I can keep going. Maria stepped inside, sitting next to Sarah at the table. Listen to me. You're doing more than most people could ever dream of. You're raising 2 kids, working full-time, and going to law school. You're already stronger than you think. But you don't have to do this alone. For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to lean on someone else. Maria helped her brainstorm solutions, checking local charities for emergency assistance, offering to help with the kids when she could, and reminding Sarah about the community resources for single mothers. After Maria left, Sarah felt exhausted but somehow lighter. She still didn't know how she was going to solve everything, but for the first time in a long while, she realized she didn't have to do it all on her own. The auditorium was filled with students in caps and gowns, the air buzzing with excitement and nervous energy. Sarah stood in line with the others, trying to steady her breath. Her children were in the front row, Ellie waving at her with a big smile, Max jumping in his seat with excitement. Today was the day. It had been years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and overwhelming challenges, but she had made it. She had done it. The ceremony dragged on, speeches and congratulatory words washing over Sarah, but she could barely concentrate. All she could think about was the moment when she would finally walk across that stage. When her name was called, Sarah stepped forward, her legs a little shaky but her heart full of pride. The applause from her fellow graduates and their families was deafening, but it didn't compare to the joy in Ellie and Max's faces as they cheered. As Sarah took her diploma from the dean, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the polished stage lights. She had come a long way from that broken woman sitting in her cramped apartment, wondering if she could ever rebuild her life. As she walked back to her seat, Ellie threw her arms around her, nearly knocking her over. "You did it, Mommy! You're a lawyer now!" Sarah smiled through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart. We did it." In that moment, surrounded by her children, the weight of the years of struggle seemed to melt away. She had found a way, despite everything, to make her dreams come true. The journey wasn't over yet, but this was a moment of pure triumph. Sarah sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the case file in front of her. It was her first pro bono case. A single mother, Maria Hernandez, had been unfairly evicted from her apartment after an altercation with her landlord. Maria had nowhere to go, and Sarah knew how much was riding on this case, not just for Maria but for her own fledgling career. She had spent the last few days familiarizing herself with tenant rights and eviction laws, and now, it was time to put her knowledge to the test. Her office was small, tucked in a building that had seen better days, but it was hers. The door had a sign reading, Sarah Bennett ESQ, affixed to it, and for the first time, the weight of the title didn't feel like a lie. Maria walked into the office with a worn look on her face, her clothes not quite fitting right, too tight, too loose, a reflection of the instability in her life. Sarah stood up to greet her, offering a warm smile. "Ms. Hernandez, I've reviewed your case, and I believe we have a strong argument," Sarah said. "Tell me about what happened." Maria shifted uncomfortably, recounting how her landlord had been increasing rent steadily while providing fewer and fewer services. When Maria had raised the issue, the landlord had become angry, threatening her and her children with eviction. A few days later, it had happened. Sarah listened intently, taking notes. This was exactly the kind of case she had imagined herself handling. Helping people like Maria, people who had no voice, no advocate. After hearing her out, Sarah leaned back in her chair, formulating a strategy. "You've been unfairly treated, and we'll fight to make sure your rights are upheld," she assured Maria. "I'll represent you free of charge, but I promise you, we're going to win this." The case wasn't easy, but Sarah's attention to detail and compassion for Maria's situation paid off. She worked tirelessly, drafting motions, gathering evidence, and organizing her arguments. Weeks later, they stood before a judge, and after a tense but straightforward hearing, the verdict came down in their favor. Maria hugged Sarah tightly after the ruling, tears of relief and gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you. You saved us." Sarah felt a rush of pride. This was only the beginning, but it was a victory that marked her place in this new life she had fought so hard to create. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Sarah stood at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly together, as she watched the opposing counsel, a seasoned, sharp-tongued lawyer, adjust his tie. He was a formidable opponent, one whose reputation for winning cases at all costs was well known. But Sarah had never been more certain of her purpose. Her client, Jessica Green, sat next to her, her eyes filled with quiet fear. Jessica had endured years of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband, and now she was seeking a protective order. Sarah had agreed to take on the case pro bono after hearing about Jessica's situation from a friend who worked at a women's shelter. Sarah turned to her notes, gathering her thoughts before speaking. She glanced briefly at the gallery. There were only a few people there, some of Jessica's family and a few advocates for domestic violence survivors. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about appearances. This was about justice. The prosecutor stood and opened with a scathing argument, attacking Jessica's credibility, questioning the validity of her accusations. Sarah's heart tightened as she listened, but she didn't falter. She knew this fight wasn't just for Jessica. It was for every woman who had ever suffered in silence. When it was Sarah's turn, she stood tall. Her voice rang clear and strong as she addressed the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today to protect a woman who has been silenced by fear for far too long. Jessica Green's story is one of survival, but she needs your help to take the final step into safety. Sarah's words were sharp, cutting through the prosecutor's arguments with precision and empathy. She spoke of the bruises Jessica had hidden for years, of the threats that had kept her bound in silence. But she also spoke of Jessica's courage, her desire to break free, and the hope that had led her to this courtroom today. Flashbacks of Sarah's own struggles flickered in her mind as she spoke, her own battles with self-doubt, with survival. But she had made it through, and so would Jessica. The courtroom was still as Sarah made her closing statement. Jessica has lived in fear for too long. She deserves the right to live without terror. And she deserves justice. The jury deliberated for only a few minutes. When the foreman stood and announced the verdict, Sarah's heart raced. Guilty. The defendant is hereby ordered to stay away from the plaintiff, Jessica Green, and is prohibited from contacting her in any manner. A wave of relief washed over Sarah, and Jessica's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Sarah. You saved my life. Sarah could barely speak, overcome with emotion. This was more than a win. It was a confirmation that her dreams, her struggles, her work, had all led to this moment. She had fought for justice, and she had won. Months passed, and Sarah's reputation as a fierce advocate for women and children grew. She had become a familiar face in nonprofit legal clinics, offering free consultations to those who couldn't afford representation. She volunteered her time, knowing that she had the privilege of helping others who were still fighting the same battles she had once faced. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting in a small community center, surrounded by a group of single mothers who had come to seek legal advice. She shared her experiences, talking about the importance of standing up for one's rights, no matter how daunting it might seem. Her words resonated with the women in the room, many of whom were struggling just as she had once done. Her children, now older, sat quietly in the back of the room, their faces filled with pride. Ellie had even drawn a picture for Sarah that morning, of her mother standing tall in a courtroom, holding a gavel. It was a simple sketch, but to Sarah, it was everything. As the meeting came to a close, one of the women approached Sarah, her face hesitant. I've been thinking about going back to school, she said. But it seems impossible. Sarah smiled, recognizing the same hesitation that had once paralyzed her. I was in your shoes once, she said. It's not easy, but it's possible. Just take it one step at a time. And don't be afraid to ask for help. The woman nodded, inspired by Sarah's words. As the women left, Sarah sat back, her thoughts drifting to the path that had led her here. She had come a long way from that small apartment in the slums. She had fought for her dream and for justice, and now, she was helping others do the same. She stood up, walking to the front of the room where the next session would begin. There was still so much more work to be done, so many more battles to fight. But for Sarah, this was just the beginning of her journey to give back, to make sure that everyone, no matter their circumstances, had access to the justice they deserved. And as she glanced at the door, her children's faces lighting up with pride, she knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she would never walk it alone again.